Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brian Strawser, and this is Just Brian. I was thinking the other day, which is always an entertaining journey for me, and my thoughts took me back to the good old days, and I thought, what does it mean to be the good old days? You always hear people say that. Well, I wish I was out in the Wild West, and I wish I was, on a fishing boat and whaling, and you hear stuff, and you think, really, was it really great? So I decided I'm going to go back and look. And I guess I could have gone back, to like BC times. I decided not to. I could have gone back to the medieval times. I decided, no, doesn't interest me. I said, let's just stick to the continent of North America. So I decided, let's look at American history. And I started in 1776. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a 25-year period. I thought, let's break this down into 25-year periods so we can handle it. And you're going to find out later on, when we get into the mid-1800s, that you're even going to have to break that up into different groups because you can't cover it all in 30 minutes. But let's just look at the life expectancy. For that 25-year slot, the average life expectancy was 36 years of age. The women might live one more year or so on average. And that's not to say that every man and woman died around 36. There were men and women that lived well into their 60s or maybe even 70s. But it was not a common thing. So let's take a way back look here at the new country called America. And of course, in 1976, that was the year that the Declaration of... I keep bumping 200 years. What the heck's wrong with me? Well, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was kind of a screw you to the King of England, basically. Now, here's the thing you have to remember. All these guys put everything on the line because if we didn't win, every one of those men would be hung as traitors. Every one of them. And the fact is that the majority of those men gave everything in the process. A lot of them died in the war. A lot of them died destitute because they gave every penny they had to the war effort. So we really shouldn't be so flippant looking at this event. It was amazing. Bear with me. Brian's having a brain freeze. 1778. That's when the French joined us in the war effort against Great Britain. Apparently, they weren't surrender monkeys back in the 1700s like they are now. But, God bless them. They even lent us money. They sent us weapons because we were using inferior technology to the British. Granted, we all had muzzle loaders, but their muzzle loaders were fine-tuned. They were made in a factory with precision measurements. Everything was the same. Ours were not so much. The bore that little muzzle, that ball went down that barrel wasn't always the same diameter. It wasn't always the same length barrel. We could not count on the same accuracy that the British had. When we started getting help, materials, and support and training from the French, well, we started kicking butt and taking names. So just this once, thank God for the French, for the weapons in 1778, and the French fries that we love today. So, no, but I'll give it to them. Come on, they're socialists. Throw them a bone. There you go. 1781. We pulled off a victory in Yorktown against that. Well, if you watch that movie that Mel Gibson was in, I forget the British Patriot, that colonel. Of course, there was a lot of leeway there, but it was a fact that with the help of the French Navy, we defeated this guy there. And he refused to come out. And when he surrendered, he sent his underling to do it and gave away the sword. That was a respectful symbol of, hey, you kicked my butt, you win. But remember that. Remember that, because this will come back in the next show and rear its ugly head, the British arrogance that, and let's face it, even though they're our allies now, they're still kind of chippy. It's just one of the things you have to deal with when you go to Europe. It's not all Sweden. So on we go. The Articles of Confederation were ratified in that year too. It was our first Constitution. This should not be taken lightly because you had so many differing opinions in the colonies, so many people that wanted different things that they had in the North that didn't fit in the South and vice versa. And yes, slavery was part of that. It's an unfortunate part of our past, but it's there and it has to be acknowledged. So they had to find common ground, and everybody had to give up something to have potential freedom, and they did it. 1783, a peace treaty was signed in Paris, France, between the British and the new country of the United States of America. That should not be taken lightly either. We flip through the books. The kids don't even know this stuff. I was shocked at some of the stuff that I found that I'm going to share with you. It was just amazing what happened back then and what these poor guys went through and these gals. Here's a good one. In 1787, there was a thing called Shays Rebellion. I had no idea that this happened. It was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Shay and 4,000 of his best friends. They were very upset on what they saw was economic and civil rights injustices already in our new nation. This was in the state of Massachusetts. And what they did, the culmination of their efforts was marching through Springfield, Massachusetts to the armory and trying to take it over. Well, what happened is they were basically wiped out, and you can still see Daniel Shay's headstone up there by Springfield, Massachusetts today. But one of the good things that happened is that there was a U.S. Constitutional Convention. And what that is that all the states gather and they actually talk about changing laws, adding laws, removing laws, which is that I can't imagine that we could actually do this in today's age. Luckily, we were a new nation back then. So they did this because of this rebellion. And George Washington was retired at the time. He was so moved by this, he left retirement. He got back into government, which he swore he'd never do. He was happy down there in Virginia. He had the plantation. He was kicking back. He was doing his wooden teeth thing. He was having a ball. So he had to say goodbye to Martha again, and he came up to New York City, which was our temporary capital at the time, and he got involved. As I see it, we'll move on to 1788, and that was when the Federalist Papers were written. Now, this kind of focused on the state of New York City in specific. There were 85 essays written urging the New York citizens to ratify the new Constitution. Apparently, there was a lot of resistance, and it wasn't guaranteed that it would be ratified. If it didn't, We went back to 13 separate colonies, and you had chaos, and that dream of a new nation would not have come to pass. It had been gone, done. Well, it worked. The Constitution was ratified, and in 1789, we got our first president named George Washington. In 1793, we had our first kind of a spy situation. And, of course, it involves a Frenchman again. Go figure. It was a fella named Edmund Charles Guinée, and it was called the Citizen Guinée. Well, I don't know why. It doesn't sound right, but that's what they called it, so that's what we're going to roll with. He was our first ambassador from France. And instead of going to greet George Washington in New York City, where he was at the time, he goes down to South Carolina, which, hey, there's nothing wrong with South Carolina. They got some killer shrimp boil there on the coast, Charleston. I don't mind going down there myself once in a while. But he didn't go down for the boil. He went down to start a war. He still had the bone to pick with Great Britain. Of course, France was at war with him. So he goes down and he starts looking for American rebels, mercenaries. And his idea was to use these men to pick a fight with Great Britain and suck us into a fight again. Well, we just finished one. We were tired. We didn't want to do this crap. So George Washington found out about this stuff. And he begged this guy. He beseeched him. He wrote letters to him. Wouldn't answer. And I guess he was a stubborn character. So in the meantime, while George Washington's trying to persuade him to do this, he'd already done it. They had ships out there with American men on it, and they were capturing British ships. And, you don't just say, well, let's have a cup of tea. I mean, they were going in the drink. They kept the ships, and they kept the supplies. And this guy was slowly working us towards another war. So finally, George had had enough. And with Thomas Jefferson's urging, he wrote an 8,000-word letter to the King of France at the time, beseeching him to pull his man back out of our new country. Well, it worked, because not only did they send him a letter to come home, they sent him an arrest warrant. And this guy knew, if I go back, they're going to cut my head off and the guillotine. So all of a sudden, he wasn't quite so chippy. He goes and he manages through, it wasn't Jefferson. It might have been Madison. Madison hated this guy's guts, but he talked the president into giving him a pardon and asylum here in America, so he lived out his days here. So we managed to avoid another war, and we got stuck with another Frenchman. It sounds like I got a bone to pick with the French. Yeah, I do. They just irritate the crap out of me. They talk funny. It sounds like they're throwing up every time they go, and they eat snails. For the life of me, dear God, I'll never understand why they eat a little botulism slug-carrying machine. But whatever. So let's move on a little bit. Let's go to 1794. The little thing called the Whiskey Rebellion. And what do you know? It takes place in western Pennsylvania, just down the road from us. If you've ever been down through there, you'll understand. They're kind of rebellious to this day. I don't know if they still make their own whiskey or not. Well, the dealio was this. We had a huge debt with France for the war. And they didn't know how to pay it off. So what they did is they put a tax on all distilled liquors, including homemade whiskey. Well, that didn't sit well with the farmers, because alcohol at the time was kind of a form of money. Our currency wasn't stable. So in addition to trading crops and animals and things of that nature, they would trade handmade tools and weapons, and they also traded whiskey. Well, when they started boosting up attacks on this, then it cut into their profits, and they didn't like it. So 500 men or so had gathered. Well, let's back up just a second. This went on for a number of years, and it just kept getting warmer and warmer and warmer. Well, finally, you had 500 men attack the home of the tax inspector. His name was General John Neville. As you can imagine, that didn't sit well with George Washington. But instead of just going in and tearing him up, he tried to reason with them. But George wasn't a fool. And what he did while he was trying to reason with these fellas is that he sent letters to all the governors, Maryland, Delaware, New York, some of the other states, Virginia, and all these governors quickly agreed to send militia to help George. Well, they didn't listen. And finally, George said, well, it's enough of that. He brought 13 militiamen up to where these fellas were, and he quelled all this rebellion. From all my research, I didn't see where anybody died. They just realized 500 versus 13,000 wasn't going to go very well. So that stopped. Let's move on to something that I've never heard of in my life until I started digging back in our history. And it was 1798, and it was the Quasiwar with France. I'd never heard of this. My partner Brendan is sitting here shaking his head, so must be he has. I read on this, and it was mind-blowing. They were...
war by proxy?
Yeah, basically. They never touched land. The deal with this little skirmish is that a war was never declared between the two of us. And as I recall, the French Revolution it was in progress, and you know it was ugly. They thought, and we thought, when they started their revolution, hey, they're going to join us. They're going to, get rid of the king, and they're going to have democracy. Well, let's stop right there. Democracy. I want to make it very clear, because I always hear it on CNN and all these other channels. Well, we have a democracy. We do not have a democracy. We have a republic. Great Britain has a democracy. Thailand has a democracy. Lots of other countries have democracies, and it's chaos. You can always tune in the TV and see these people on occasion throwing furniture and stuff when they get mad. It's just mob rule. We have a republic. We have representatives. We have the Electoral College, and it works. It's there to protect us in the middle of the country from Los Angeles and from New York City. You hear talk now about, let's get rid of the Electoral College. Well, how about you?
Say that when it doesn't work for them.
Well, of course. Yeah, well, you know what?
You did the same thing when Obama won in 2008.
Exactly.
Come on.
So my response to those who want to get rid of the Electoral College is leave. Take Jane Fonda with you and get on a plane and go to Great Britain. You can go down to Parliament and you can watch all the fools yell and carry on and call each other bad names, and, there's your democracy. I'm going to stick with the republic. But I digress a little bit. Let's get back to 1798. The reason this whole skirmish started is because, Napoleon was in there. Cocky little fella. By the way, that's where you get the Napoleon Complex term from. It's just short man complex. Pretty sweet, actually. There's nothing cooler than to watch a little guy get about 2 feet taller and just 5 breasts. So, we refused to pay back that debt that we owed them, because it was a totally different group of people. It wasn't the king anymore. So we said, screw you. So their response, they started attacking our ships at sea. And in some of the places like the Mediterranean and places like that. So what do? We started attacking their ships back. And it got pretty ugly for a 2-year period. They finally came to an agreement that this wasn't very profitable for either side. And it was also a well-known secret. It wasn't so secret. Napoleon was trying to fight a war with Great Britain. He had a little heat from the Spanish, and he couldn't afford to keep doing this stuff. So it all kind of came to an end. But that was amazing to me. I didn't know anything about it. And as we go on here in the next 218 years of history, over the next many weeks, I'm going to share some more things. I don't know if you guys have heard them. If you have, well, just have pity on me. I was driving a truck at the time. So we'll stop with 1800. That's when Thomas Jefferson was elected president. And at that point, I realize it's a little earlier than we usually stop, but I promised you 30 minutes or less, and I'm going to deliver. So, for now, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening. Hopefully, we'll see you next week. I'm Brian Strawser, and this is Just Brian.